If you thought this pandemic was bad, wait till you see what's next. Are we sleepwalking into a dictatorship? Hello there, you 4.5 million wonders, you beautiful, wistful coral sweeping across the ocean floor. Have you started to recognize that the pandemic is being used to introduce powers that will never be walked back? And have you struggled to describe this to friends and family, or even found that those views being expressed is laughed at and lauded as conspiratorial crazy speak? Well, that's why I spoke to Professor Brad Evans, a legit academic and critical thinker, professor of violent studies. I know, it sounds like a crazy name, at Bristol University. He came on my podcast, Under the Skin, as a guest. It's on Luminary. Get it if you want it. It's a subscription model podcast to talk about the pandemic and the unique powers that are being introduced. Watch this conversation. You'll learn from it. This is university level education, but for everybody. Absorb it. Arm yourself with knowledge.
Do you talk about some of this stuff? I'm assuming you do in Ecce Humanitas. Is that how to say it? Your new book. The bit that I'm looking at now is it says that you look at the changing nature of sacrificial violence from the theological origins of sacrifice, which we all understand, to the contemporary exhaustion of the the modern victim in contemporary civilization. What do you mean that? Well, there is a kind of, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, in terms of what I guess a lot of this stuff is touched upon in that book. And what I try to tease out is the way in which certain appropriations of a sacred politics can be taken by dominant orders for power in order to smuggle violence continually into that regime. And to allow it to be seen as, like all, in order for a sacred project to exist, it must appear timeless. It has to be, eternal. So, and what I try to map out in the book then is how we can understand a great deal about the history of violence and war by the ways in which different sacred objects appear throughout history. So if you want to understand Christianity, we understand the untouchable body of Christ and how violence was carried out in the name of Christ in terms of the old religious wars. If we want to understand then the nation state, the sacred object and the untouchable object for power of the nation state becomes the military hero. And the military hero becomes and there's a wonderful moment in Goya's painting where he paints, the military hero almost like in a Christ-like position, who's kind of, just about to be sacrificed, shot on the 3rd of May. And the body of Christ becomes the military hero very quickly. And that becomes the sacred object. Now with liberalism, that sacred object becomes the victim. And then we know how the victim becomes the ways in which we can wage humanitarian war, because the victim, especially the young child and the woman, becomes this kind of untouchable object. Now, if liberalism is dead, my question is, well, what's the new sacred object? Well, the sacred object is humanity. We are all now told we have to sacrifice constantly. Right? We have to sacrifice, for, the pandemic is a big motif of our own sacrifice for others. But my question is, it's not about the sacrifice, or even though the sacrifice itself is very much linked to histories of violence, it's what becomes the dominant sacred or the theological power. If humanity is now the sacred object, what's saving us in a world in which we no longer believe in God? And that is where the technology comes in. It hovers over us like this kind of imminent, all-seeing divine revelation that's going to save us from everything. And that to me is where there's an appropriation of the more spiritual aspects of what the sacred might mean, put to use in the service of power, because there's no better way to compel allegiance than if you can mobilize the sacred in a very particular direction. And that's where if the technology, and I was thinking again in terms of the way in which we talked about a bit earlier, Russell, about, the difference between the 20th century and now. If we think of totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, we often thought about them in terms of governed by secrecy and governed by the operations of secrecy. But we still knew their structure, we still knew their organization, we still knew their power. There's a dream of totalitarianism where you have perfect knowledge about all citizens, but the citizens have absolutely no idea about how the system operates. That's technology today. And whether I post something which is critical of technology and somehow it gets no likes. So, have I been shadow banned? I've got no idea, right? So, and it makes you yourself think, am I being conspiratorial here? But I think we have no understanding of the operation of this power because it's like a god. It's an excess. You cannot know it. And I think that's where it becomes, a system of unrivaled power through the object of the sacredness.
That's cool. It's like the mechanic for Kafka's paranoia is present. It's with us. Someone must have been lying. Like it can just happen to you now. It could, like, you don't know how the machinery, and also Kafka preempts that it will be kind of bureaucratic and plain, as opposed to the sort of animal or insectoid experience of being human. This plain, bland, crushing, unknowable force, this unloving God of all edges. Yeah, that's cool. And I've got loads of things to talk to you about, as well as obviously sort of mining you for information, a verb you'll be familiar with, as your accent denotes. And but like also I want to I think we're going to do some stuff with Luminary next year, God willing, where we do a sort of masterclass stuff, like where we like set out some kind of areas of education. I don't want it to beseem or even really be too academic, but I do want it to be robust. And so perhaps this is something we can talk about. Perhaps we'll get a chance to chat offline over the next week.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, just keep us posted.
What did you think of that? I really like what Brad says about what you make sacred you can use to control people. Do you see how that is a kind of religious impulse? Do you see how we have aspects of our atavistic mind still dominating the way that we live our lives today? Man is an animal that worships. I mean, mankind. I'm not being sexist there. So listen, tell me what you think. You watched the conversation now. You understood it. If you want to learn more, sign up to Luminary. You can get it off Apple. Anywhere in the world you can get that app. It's pretty reasonably priced, I think, but otherwise just continue to enjoy the free content and let me know in the comments below what you think. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and please sign up to my Awakening side channel where I give you techniques, tips and meditations even that will help you cope with the crazy world that you find yourself living in now. Also subscribe to my mailing list so I can communicate with you directly. You know what the world's like. Suddenly we might lose the ability to communicate directly. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. Do you know it's probably even a little bit better? And if you're in the UK between January and May 2022, come see me live. But more important than all of that paraphernalia is that you stay free.